Hi. A couple of days ago, I did a video talking about things that had once been trends in the watch world that I think today have actually just become just part of the watch world. Today, I want to look at the other end of that cycle. I want to talk about call them trendlets, the little beginning ripplings of things that I believe are going to build to become real trends and potentially one day in the far distant future, perhaps even just regular old parts of the watch community. See me after the intro and we'll get into it. Hi, I'm Pete McConville, and here I like to overthink, overanalyze, and basically just geek out on watches far more than probably a grown man should. If that sounds like something you're interested in, watch the video, and if you like that, hit the whole like, subscribe thing. What I want to talk about today are some ripples in the watch force, sort of these little things that I think maybe aren't even trends yet. Perhaps they are, and I've just been a little slow, but these are things, I'm going to call them trendlets, the first ripples after a stone's been dropped that may grow into something in future. The first of these that I'm going to talk about is neo-retro designs. Now, when I did my last one on trends that have become staples, a few of the comments came back and said, I missed out the idea of classic and retro designs being a staple of how things are produced these days. And you're right, I did kind of deliberately jump over that. I thought that had sort of become so obvious that had been around for a while, it didn't need me to point it out. But when I talk about neo-retro designs, I'm talking about something a little different. What we've seen so far has been a lot of retro or vintage inspired design, but it's very specific. It's things which have picked up very specific watches and recreated those, or which have picked up very specific timeline, so a very specific period, and said, here is a watch representing that very specific period. So something like a Longines Legend Diver. Perfect example of a watch which is a re-edition of an old past design, or and maybe something like a Tudor Black Bay, which, whilst is not necessarily a one-to-one copy of a previous Tudor, is clearly reaching back to Tudors of 1958, 1958, Tudors of 1954, and drawing very specific cues from a very narrow time scale. So that's your classic definition of retro design. In the design world, neo-retro is slightly different. Neo-retro is not based on any particular watch or even any particular time scale. Rather, what we do is take something which is broadly retro, potentially from multiple time periods, a little bit of 40s, a little bit of 50s, a little bit of 30s. We're not sure where it's come from, but then combine that with new ideas and new approaches and new fits and finishes, so that what you end up with is a kind of fusion of new and old. This is something that's been kicking around really probably for about 2 or 3 years. I'm going to say probably the first time it really came up on my radar was the Longines Spirit collection, which was very interesting in that it's not part of their heritage collection, but it's not really part of their new stuff. It tends to try and blend the two. And we've seen Longines double down on that now with what they're doing with the Hydro Conquest line. More recently, watches which the Hydro Conquest never quite took off, but now that it's got these nondescript, not linked to any particular past watch, but vintage cues, is really getting a lot of buzz, is really getting a lot of excitement. So I think Longines is one of the brands that's really embracing this idea of retro, neo-retro, and running with it. I think Breitling is doing something similar with, for example, the most recent Super Ocean dive watch, which is kind of looking back at a very particular watch, but then kind of not, and bringing in a whole bunch of other colors and taking it off in a wholly new contemporary direction. And obviously, I think one of the best examples of this has got to be the most recent Tag Heuer glassbox Carreras, which again, kind of look like retro watches. They kind of look like something historic, but aren't. They're not really linked to anything from the past, except in very broad terms. And even then, it's difficult to pin down exactly what it is that they're referencing. So they've got some elements which are particularly forward-looking and all new. So I think this idea of neo-retro, of sort of defocusing a little bit, focusing less on a particular watch, a particular time period, but just broadly something that looks kind of historic, but with a much more modern, forward-looking twist, is going to be the future. I think there's a few brands doing it, but I think this is going to be the way out of the closed box that is just plain old retro design. I think the problem with retro design is at the end of the day, you are locked in a box, constrained by what that watch has been in the past or what was in that time scale. The idea of neo-retro opens one end of the box and gives you a starting point, but also gives you unlimited possibilities for moving forward. And I think that's why this is going to be a huge trend moving forward. Okay, so I promise everything I'm going to speak about next is a lot less involved and a lot quicker than the last discussion. So the next big trendlet I see, I'm going to call more dress, less stress. And a lot of you are keen to see this too. When I started talking about this, a lot of you gave comments that what you want to see is more dressy options, more complex cases, more interesting cases, that sort of stuff. And I think the future, it looks good for you. I think that if you look at what's happening with a bunch of brands and you are seeing kind of a retreat from the all-out sports watch, and you're seeing a lot more dress sports, you're seeing a lot more just straight up dress watches coming out. And I think that trend is going to accelerate. Rolex are a fantastic marker of trends. They don't set trends, but they are fantastic in that they're never the first to do anything, but they're always a good marker that a trend has got legs, and that they pulled the Cellini line and they came in with the 1908 indicates to me that even Rolex see this is a thing. This is a trend that's going to happen and they want to be in on it too. Okay, so trendlet number 3 I'm going to talk about here is slightly more sensible and slightly more transparent collaboration between brands. And perhaps with that, a slight retreat from the idea of all in-house everywhere. I think that over the last probably 5 to 10 years, a lot of brands have really gone to try to go all in-house. And I feel like that has done many of the brands and us as a watch collecting community a bit of a disservice. It means that you've got this proliferation of watches, watch movements, for example, which may or may not be serviceable into the future. You've got brands that have now invested a lot of money in having this in-house technology, and as a result can't give us some of the more interesting complications on the top of, you know, a third-party movement they might have done because they've spent that money. Or if they do develop a complication over the top of that in-house movement, then that, by God, will be the only version of that complication they use. So you end up with, you know, big, thick Tudor Black Bay GMTs where, because they're kind of committed to using their in-house one, and they don't have enough money necessarily to go and develop a thinner in-house GMT off other movements. They've committed and are stuck there. I think you are seeing more and more brands starting to use Kinesi, for example. You're starting to see more and more brands using things like La Joux Perret, and do so openly, and openly talk about the fact that this is what they're doing. And so what I think you're going to see is less and less, this is just mine, this is just my internal brand, my internal movement, for example. And what you're going to see is more and more brands collaborating together to produce a design that they share. Even And in many cases, they will announce that publicly, and in many cases, they won't. So the example I'll give here is, obviously, there's more and more brands getting involved in the Kinesi side and that connection, and doing so openly. We've already spoken about Le Jour Perret. Likewise, we've heard through Only Watch that it looks like Tudor has been working up a new in-house chronograph movement, but the rumor is that that was developed with support from Breitling. Breitling providing some architecture and some other support in how to do that. I think that is an eminently sensible thing to do. I think that, for example, there's talk about Breitling producing a new in-house three-hander next year. I actually hope that that is not fully in-house. I hope that that's not a whole new architecture. I actually hope that that's developed with Kinesi or someone else and builds on that, because as an owner of that watch, that's going to give me so many more possibilities and so much more comfort than the idea that, you know, I'm buying into a one-off movement that's not shared with anyone else, and that could have all sorts of problems later. And also will be really hard for Breitling to develop moving forward. The idea that instead they're just part of the larger Kinesi family would actually be a much better result for me. And that's what I'm hoping they do. And I'm hoping and I'm thinking that's going to be a trend across watches. Okay, so trendlet number 4, I'm going to call it the off-piste media development. I, along with a whole bunch of other people, have complained bitterly about what's happening in the watch media. The way that enthusiast-run kind of watch media is in this bind. It doesn't have the time or the expertise or the editorial freedom to say and do the things we want it to do. But what I have noticed is increasingly the best writers from within that community have actually gone off-piste and are now producing their own work separately to their mastheads. Sometimes this is quite closely related to the masthead. So I'll take an example here, OT the podcast. Felix and Andy love the podcast, love what they do there. But in that, even in the podcast form, which is a little bit constrained, they're a little bit constrained about what they can do. But next to that, they run a Discord server. And on the Discord server, Andy and Felix and all of the listeners can get involved in a much more proactive scrum. And what you find is the journalists that are a little bit constrained when they're speaking as OT are much more free and able to express their opinions when they move across to their Discord, for example. Similarly, if you go across to Substack, what you find is a lot of journalists who write for Mr. Porter or who write for various other mastheads also run their own newsletters over on Substack. And there, because it's now just them speaking with their own expertise in their own place, but with the access that they gained via their other, if you like, major paying jobs, are able to provide a much richer and much more authentic media experience. So I think that is only going to grow. I think that the future of real quality media for people that want quality media is a little off-piste. It's not going to be from the big websites. It's not going to be from the big YouTube channels. It's going to be from the individual news Substacks and Slack channels and Discord servers that the journalists run alongside those. And I think that is something that we should all be applauding and think, because I think that's as good as it's going to get for us. So I hope that that's going to grow, and I certainly want to do everything I can to help it. Okay, so the next big trendlet that I see developing into a bit of a wave is the death of the traditional Kickstarter sub $500 microbrand. They're still going to be around, so they're not going to die completely. It's not like there's never going to be another Kickstarter or never going to be another $500 diver. They will be there disrupting the industry. But I can tell you as a YouTuber, if you run a video on a new one of these watches, no one watches it. The view numbers are really low. their levels of engagement are really low. No one's that keen on them anymore. I think that part of the market is either full or we're kind of over it and moving on. So people like Zealous are going to keep doing what Zealous does, but that's because they're just churning through the same fans that they've had for a while. But I don't see them growing or going anywhere. I don't see new people coming in and challenging them. I think that part of the market is now done. I think what has replaced it is the 2,000 US dollar quasi. Are they independent, or is this an independent, or is this a micro brand kind of brand? I think that's where there's some growth coming. But in that traditional Kickstarter sub $500 diver, I think it's okay. So my last trendlet that I'm sensing in the waters, the turgid waters of the watch community, is that the mole rats are coming in out of the cold. What do I mean by that? There's a bunch of brands which have never been fan favorites with the watch community. I'm talking one of my favorite brands, Alpina, maybe Raymond Vise, maybe Maurice Lacroix. Going even a little bit further, there's like a lot of the fashion-y kind of brands that maybe a lot of people bought for their first watch, but either for them or for their wives, but would never really consider going back to now that they're in the hobby. So brands like Nixon or, God forbid, Versace. These brands have really not got much, if any, coverage at all in the watch media. But I feel like that's changing. I'm suddenly seeing Nixon ads on Worn and Wound. I'm seeing reviews of Versace watches so those brands weren't picked at random, by the way. So reviews of a Versace watch over at a blog to watch. I'm seeing the Raymond Veal, a brand most people don't really talk about at all, but this new Freelander, which, by the way, A, that World Timer is a really nice looking watch, and B, it's getting, I hesitate to say buzz, but it's getting talk. People are beginning to, maybe start looking at their stuff. Now, if I go look at Raymond Veal and Versace and Nixon, they've got a lot of horrible watches too, but I'm just hearing their names. I'm hearing those brands get spoken about in places where I'm not used to hearing them spoken about. And I'm hearing people say nicer things about their watches than I'm used to hearing people say about those watches. So I'm wondering if this is just us getting a bit more comfortable with the idea that we can embrace the places that many people came from, and that guilty pleasures perhaps don't need to be quite so guilty. Or maybe it's a response to a lot of the brands that people moved to are now, maybe you moved from Raymond Veal to Tudor or to Longines, but now you're watching those brands like move away from you in pricing. So maybe the places like Raymond Veal and Maurice Lacroix are sort of re-emerging as a place for us. I don't know. This is worth digging into a bit. But yeah, I'm just feeling that, as I say, the mall rats, those shopping mall, jeweler shop special brands, may be coming in from the cold a little bit for the watch community. So anyway, there's 6 little trendlets that I've kind of been picking up on. What about you? Do you think there are any others that are coming? Do you think I'm full of rubbish and that none of these are going to go anywhere? Let me know in the comments below. I've been Pete McConville. This is what I do, talking about watches and stuff. If it's like something you're interested in, like, subscribe, and we will see each other later. Bye.